Hi, this is Aaron Wren. Welcome to the show. I'm delighted to be joined today by special guest Sohrab Ahmari. He is the founder and editor of Compact Magazine, which you can view at compactmag.com. And he's also the author of the newly released book, Tyranny Inc. How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It. He's holding it up because the version I have is an ebook, which is great for reading, but not so great for holding up for the screen. So, Sohrab, thanks for joining.
Aaron, thanks for having me. I should note that Aaron is a past contributor to
Yeah,
Compact as
yeah.
well with a very sage piece.
Well, I'm gonna have a new one coming out for you, hopefully in the not too distant
Can't
future.
wait.
And there's a link to buy the book in the show notes, along with a link to my newsletter. If you're not already a subscriber, you should join that. I wasn't sure what to expect when reading your book, but this is really a litany of corporations behaving badly. And it's a lot of themes that I've actually tweeted about over the years, and I found myself nodding along with a lot of it. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you cover, because they are really quite outrageous, a lot of them. One of my favorites is the employment agreement. So you get a new job, and you show up to work on day one, and they give you a stack of papers. And so you have to fill out your little I-9 that proves you're allowed to work here, and you fill out your W-4 to get your taxes all set up, and you do all the employee information and the enrollment benefits. And then they hand you like a 20-page printout of an employment agreement that you're supposed to sign, that you don't read, and you have no idea what's in it. But what you discover is it's full of egregious clauses that basically sign your life away to the company. So what are some of the things that companies put into these employment agreements?
Yeah, sure. By the way, it's worth noting that companies go out of their way to describe those documents as not the agreement itself. The agreement is usually like the email they sent where they say, hey, would you like to get this job for, I don't know, $80,000 a year, blah, blah, blah. This is your role. And then they try to make everything else seem like employee guidelines. And for legal reasons, we don't need to get into that, but it's just a side detail. The main thing is that, you usually sign away to your new employer a vast range of ways to surveil and coerce you. So I actually, in that relevant chapter of the book, I apologize, alarm went off. In the relevant chapter of the book, I actually put up more or less, I describe an actual contract from a very, very large kind of financial services company, let's say, where it includes the right to confiscate your personal devices, not only obviously your work laptop, but your personal laptop as well, if you use it to access company networks, which, by the way, they encourage you to do. You give up the right to complain about the company even after you've left through what's called a non-disparage clause. They complain the right for you to try to recruit friends to even if they've since left the company, and so on and so forth. But the main one that I go into, which is very amusing, is that you give up the right to your own voice, online persona, even your singing voice. And in an earlier and more innocent age, the reason they would have you do that is because they want to put your picture in a company brochure or a training video. But this, in the actual employment agreement, it specifies that you're giving up your right to these things: your voice, your persona, everything about you, your voice on calls, etc., in order to be potentially leased for commercial licensing, for commercial purposes, because there's a vast market right now for human likeness data, for voice, etc., that helps train AI. It helps train the Siri service of Apple, etc. And you, as part of consenting to this, you give up the right to bring any legal claim, the use of your persona, your voice, etc., in perpetuity, both against your employer and whatever third party it chooses to license your persona to. So that's
Can I read an excerpt about that? I actually made a note about that because it's so crazy.
yeah.
Here's an excerpt from the book. Now, let's say your visual likeness is sold and subsequently used by a different entity in doctored pornography, or by a future web service that allows users to create their own virtual porn using a database of human likenesses. The question arises, would you be able to lodge a civil claim against your employer or the entity that created the video? Not if the court strictly interprets your contract on Lochner's principles. You enjoyed the liberty of contract. Remember, that's crazy, but it is true.
It's,
I mean,
it's
that's
true.
what's
It's true. I
it's
mean,
crazy.
I spoke to a lot. I spoke to a lot of employment lawyers for this, and they all basically came to that conclusion. Again, because you release not just the employer but any subsequent licensees in perpetuity for any kind of harassment, privacy, etc. claims that you might otherwise have under common law. And when the reference there to Lochner is, so there was a Supreme Court decision in 1905 that invalidated on liberty of contract grounds a New York state law that limited bakers' working hours to 60 weeks. It came to stand in for a broader sort of tendency of the Supreme Court in that era, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to strike down any interference by the state on health or public policy grounds with the employment, with private contracts in general, so that the liberty of contract in the employment context was almost elevated to a principle as sacred as, let's say, free speech. And so that's the era. And what I argue in the book is that we've, in some ways, as the New Deal order has been eroded over the past generation or two, and we can get into that, the Lochner era has somehow come back. And the premise of Lochnerism, or liberty of contract theory, is that the relations between employer and employee are under normal circumstances are optimal, and therefore any external interference with it is unwarranted and, in fact, detrimental. And the basis of this optimality is the fact that employer and employee both have a right to walk away from each other, so they can freely contract, but each under what's called at will employment, each is free to walk away from the other. The problem is that that's not how real labor markets work. First of all, that ideally maybe come about when you have full employment, but because when that means the labor market is pretty tight, you can say full employment is about like 5% jobless rate. But the U.S. economy has only achieved 5% jobless rate for about like a quarter of the previous several decades. The rest of them, we have not achieved full employment. So that's one reason why this mutual right to walk away is questionable. And the second factor is that in the formation of the agreement, there's just such a vast disparity in power. Again, like you said when you set out the scenario, Aaron, you've typically just gotten an email saying, we would like you to be a sales assistant at $45,000 a year working out of our Houston office. And you say, sure, that sounds great. And then you move from Minneapolis to Houston, you move your family, you lease a new house, or you buy a new house, you change your kid's school, your partner, your spouse changes their jobs, etc. You show up and they hand you a fat, that employment guidance that includes giving up the right to your personal likeness. Nobody says, oh, actually, I'd like to question this clause. Could we draw another contract? That's simply not an option for the vast majority of people. Vanishingly few people have challenged that and occasionally been able to prevail in court. But for the rest, because of the fact that labor is much less easily mobile than capital is, you go along.
People don't even know what they're doing or signing, really. And part of it, I can tell you, a company that I actually went to work for had a clause in their contract that said they owned the intellectual property rights to everything you created while you worked with them, even if you produced it on your own time with your own equipment. So if you sign that, it basically says, we own the photos you took of your kid with your phone at his birthday party or something like that. And in this case, I actually did request a copy of all the things they would expect me to sign, and I saw that, and I was able to negotiate getting that edited.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, but a handful of weirdos like me, asked for that stuff in advance. And the other thing is that these aren't really contracts in the way that you might think, like a coach of a team having a contract. They don't give you any rights. You're an at-will employee. They can fire you at any time. So they always make clear you don't have an employment contract. You don't have a contract with us. We can get rid of you, but you're going to sign this thing that just unilaterally gives us all these rights, but you get nothing in return.
Right. That's why I mentioned at the very beginning that those documents they give you, they go out of your way to say it's employee guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that is not the employment agreement. The
Right.
employment agreement is just the at-will, your at-will status.
Yeah, it's really amazing, and we could go into the fact that you have to agree to arbitration, this other stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there, but I want to get to some other points in the book. One of which is private equity and the things that private equity do. We could do a 5-hour podcast on private equity, but why don't you give me some of your highlights from the private equity world?
Yeah, sure. So, there is this impression widespread, including and especially among American pension administrators, people who administer pensions for, public employees, state, local, county, you name it. And also other sort of sophisticated large investors like universities and so on that have huge endowments to invest. There's this impression that private equity is this magical way to beat the regular public stock market and make enormous returns. The first thing to note is that that's not been true for a long time. In fact, contrary to the impressions that we know from polling of most pensions administrators, private equity doesn't really do that much better than the public stock market, and sometimes is worse. Why does it matter that especially that public pensions administrators believe this? It's because nearly half the funding for private equity comes from entities like that, from retirement systems across the country at every level of government you can imagine are pouring their contributors' retirement funds into private equity. What does private equity do? They typically they form a partnership, they use some of their own money, and then they borrow a lot more to take over a firm, and then supposedly in their own telling to make the allocation of capital more efficient, and then they exit and move on. The thing that they actually do is typically to basically disinvest the firm from itself. An American corporation, classically what a company does is, you have a product you want to sell, and you go to the bank or whatever your financial institution is, and you borrow some money. Either you give away shares or it's a loan, so you agree to pay back on interest. But the point is that your product, let's say, is a hit, and you sell it to consumers, and they buy it. You're doing great, and so you pay back the loan you took out, or you pay dividends to the people who financed you initially to reward them for the risk they took, and that's all good and fine. That's just normal capitalism. But since the rise of private equity and hedge funds, the American corporation doesn't behave like that. It does not. It doesn't reinvest as well in the business in order to maintain its capital stock. The pressure from private equity is to basically transform all revenue, after taxes and interest and so on, turn everything else over back to the shareholders, so that the firm is essentially cannibalizing itself, in part because it's also so much laden with debt that the firm is no longer reinvesting in the business in a way that a normal business should do. And as my friend Oren Cass has found, like half of American corporations now are eroding themselves in this way. They're not actually reinvesting anything in the business. They're giving everything back to the financial economy, which is to say to Wall Street. And that's not good for a company. As you can imagine, companies need investment. So, one example I give is not private equity, is a hedge fund that took over Sears. A lot of people think Sears, the legendary retailer, went down just because it couldn't compete with Amazon. But that's only half the story, or less than half the story. It's true that, like, at the turn of the new millennium, Sears faced a great deal of competition from not just actually Amazon. At that point, what was more important were salesman-free stores that were just more customer savvy, like Circuit City and Best Buy and so on. And that's the kind of competition it was facing, and it was struggling because it's a behemoth. And in the 1970s and 80s, Sears had expanded into just a vast range of non-related businesses that had nothing to do with its core retail business. It was called the stocks and socks strategy, meaning not only would you buy like sturdy all-American socks at Sears, but also Sears offered something called Coldwell Banker, which was a real estate firm, Prodigy, which was an internet service firm, the Discover card, which was obviously a credit card, Actually, most people don't know that that's a Sears product, or initially was. So anyway, its business was in shambles, and it was facing rising competition. And at that point, a guy named Eddie Lampert, a former roommate of Secretary of Treasury, future Secretary of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, bought Sears and Kmart through his hedge fund that was called ESL. And the way he managed it was just to what's called to manage for cash flow. That just means just trying to extract as much cash as you can. So like at Sears stores, there were like potholes all over the parking lot. Fixtures were broken. Cash registers weren't working. There weren't enough staff, so that even when the salesman made a successful sale, like on an expensive bed, they couldn't finalize the sale because there was no one who could actually man a working cash register. And so it was just this very stingy kind of pinched view of what you should do with a business, and it drove Sears to the ground. And in fact, if you look at the behavior of investment behavior of Sears under Eddie Lampert, it was a classic case of Wall Street led erosion. And so I tell the story of this guy, Bruce Miller, who worked for 35 years at the auto shop of his local Sears in New Jersey, just solid working class guy, paid all his bills, was able to initially buy a house, buy a car. And then when Eddie Lampert was done, he lost his house, he lost his car, lost his health insurance, had to move into a trailer park from the nice kind of modest home that he had. So, when private equity, when Wall Street takes over a firm, people don't know this, the likelihood of the firm going bankrupt goes up dramatically. It's because they don't invest in the firm, and they also lever it up with debt. And that's fine for them. Like a private equity fund might have a portfolio of 10 companies. And if 9 out of the 10 fail, but one does really well, it's all a wash and it works out for them. But like the ordinary worker or community can't make a similar bet. Like a town can't be like, well, we have 10 businesses in town, but if 9 go down and 1 succeeds, we'll be good. Or the employee can't think, I'll take 10 jobs simultaneously, and if 9 of them fail, that's fine, because it'll all be a wash with the success of the 10th one. The risk profile of kind of aggressive private equity and hedge funds is not the same as workers and communities. And so this is, pretty destructive to the overall economy. And the defenders of these practices will say, well, look how much money is moving around. This looks like, in a superficial way, it looks like growth, even because it's financial activity. But if you look at what's actually happening, there's all that's doing is money is moving around, and mainly it's moving out of the real economy and into the asset ledgers right. of big finance. This is not building anything. It's not creating anything useful.
Yeah, I see where, the financial theory would say, well, maybe some companies should sort of been run off for cash, or some should be sort of broken up for parts. But when you start doing that at scale, and you see the kind of erosion of our competitive base as countries like China start eating our lunch because they're not thinking that way, and then you see the impact on people in communities when these things happen. Similar thing just happened with Greyhound bus. I saw some articles that people were just waking up to this. Some private equity type company acquired Greyhound and realized that Greyhound's bus stations were worth more than really the transportation business. So they split the company into 2. One had all the real estate, the other had the transportation company, and they're basically eBaying off all the bus stations. And now everybody who wants to ride a Greyhound bus has to get off on the curb, which basically they're just expecting to get that free from the city. And it's very clear that they expect kind of Greyhound to just go under. They don't really care if the bus company survives. They don't really care about lower income people who need a form of inner city transportation. It's just like, we see these real estate assets that are valued, let's get them. They did that to the newspapers too. They realized the newspapers' buildings were worth more than the papers. It's like, let's destroy the newspapers and we'll just get these buildings and print some money. And they also do it to public sector assets as well. The Republicans love public-private partnerships. I was just every time I open the paper, there's another one of these. One of the big water companies in England, Thames Water, was privatized by the UK government. It had no debt when it was privatized, and now the thing's about to go under. It's been massively ladled up with debt. They disinvested. The system is a shambles. It doesn't work. And these people who bought it, they told, private capital is so much more efficient and effective, and we want these stable returns. They just gutted. They just took a public asset and shredded it to take every penny out they could. And now, great if that's a financial business, but this was a public asset. And this is like the water company. Okay. This is what's happening just across company after company after company.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on, so I tell a similar story about the privatization of what ordinary Americans just think of as, common public goods. I tell a story about the privatization of emergency services. So private firefighting actually has been around for a long time. In fact, in the United States, firefighting initially began as a volunteer activity. Then these volunteer groups in the early 19th century became very predatory. They would like physically fight each other on the street, because if you were the first to put out a fire, you got the payout from the insurance company. So beginning of the mid 19th century, actually in the city of Cincinnati, it was the first sort of publicly funded, professionalized, still volunteer operated, but now publicly funded and trained and professionalized fire service. And that grew in the aftermath of the Civil War, where Civil War veterans, coming back from the war, would become firefighters. And that's the model we're used to. Now, there were these private firms that called, the most important one is called Rural Metro, that was founded in Arizona in the 1940s. And that makes sense for certain consumers, to be clear. So if you're a large landholder across the Mountain West where there isn't any incorporated areas, it makes sense because there's no other, who's going to put out your fire. So rural metro makes sense for that. Likewise, if you're a Hollywood studio where, fire is an enormous risk to your business, having an on-site privatized firefighting makes total sense. I have no objection to that. But, increasingly beginning in the aftermath of the Great Recession, rural metro and similar companies began to take over, rural firefighting in like ordinary kind of communities, not in the types of settings that I was talking about, which should be kind of an exception. And as outrageous as kind of that can be when people are suddenly hit with a bill, it was also then Rural Metro was bought by a Manhattan private equity firm called Warburg Pincus, which loaded up with debt in classic private equity style. And what it was doing is basically turning to really savage billing tactics to try to squeeze as much as it can, given that they weren't investing in the business. So they would bill like babies, like literally the name of the baby would be on a bill saying, because you haven't paid for your ambulance service, this is going to be reported to a credit reporting agency. Now, the baby was born in one of their ambulances, and Rural Metro often initially, its first point of contact with customers was through collections. It wouldn't even go through normal billing. It would just, you interact with Rural Metro, a collections company would come after you. And so so that's all bad enough. But what I report, which is unreported, and it's, I think, the one kind of the piece of reportorial piece of the book that I'm most proud of, is the fact that I reveal that a lot of the pension plans of firefighters and emergency services workers, EMTs, which are public employees, their own pension plans are investing in Warburg Pincus and KKR, which is another private equity firms that owns these kind of privatizing businesses. In other words, workers' own capital is being used to divest them of their own jobs because their own pension plans are investing in private equity funds that are in the business of privatizing these services. So that's like sort of doubly outrageous, because they by taking over the private firm, they actually obviously reduce the quality of its services, but then it's the workers in those industries themselves who they're funding their own dispossession.
We could go on and on and on about this, but I'm only going to ask one more. I mean, you got like a whole litany of examples, but one other thing, and I don't think the specific example I'm going to say, it's actually in the book, but it's about the politicization of business. Conservatives have this theory that corporations exist to maximize profits, so they don't want to gratuitously offend a potential customer or turn away business. And it was Michael Jordan. They asked Michael Jordan why he's not being more political. He's like, hey, Republicans buy tennis shoes too. I want to sell shoes to people. I don't want to alienate any consumers by making political statements. Well, that's certainly no longer true. And in fact, corporations that will cease doing business with people for political reasons. And there was a case in the UK recently where a very prominent politician, Nigel Farage, he's the guy that led the charge for Brexit, was dumped as a customer by one of the oldest and most prestigious banks in England because they didn't like his politics, and then they lied about it. And you hear these stories about people being debanked
Yeah.
And we don't like you. You're conservative, or you're a gun company, or you're this. We're just not going to do business with you. And as there's more and more consolidation, it's not like you can just go across the street to somebody else. It's when it's like Apple decides they don't like your politics and says your app can't go into iPhone. There's no other way to get your app on that iPhone. They
Yeah.
control whether you could even be in business. What's
Absolutely.
going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with debanking. It's a really scary practice, because if you can't partake of the medium of exchange in our life, in our market-driven lives, you're sort of unpersoned. And this practice actually took off in the aftermath of January 6th. Whatever you think of the January 6th defendants, I happen to think, it's a very ugly scene, and they shouldn't have done that. But they have a right to try to defend themselves from the federal government, and they have a right to try to privately fundraise for their legal defense. But these crowdfunding sites and payment processors like PayPal began to shut down January 6th defendants' fundraising accounts. And this is the first mass scale debanking that we know of. The next time it happened was in Canada with the truckers who opposed the vaccine mandates up there. Again, in this case, it was government directed, where the Trudeau government invoked the Canada's Emergency Act, which is as sort of sinister sounding as it sounds, it invoked that to force the debanking of the truckers and even people who were supporting the truckers privately, financially. Then it happened in the Netherlands with the Dutch farmers who were tired of the green mandates, which would have just destroyed their livelihoods, which will destroy their livelihoods, in fact, where they were being forced to cull like vast swaths of their animals, cows and sheep and stuff. And the Netherlands is a hugely agricultural society. Anyway, not to get bogged down, but they were debanked as well. And then most recently, it happened with Nigel Farage, as you pointed out, Aaron, Coutts, which is the bank that serves the royal family, or members of the royal family in Britain, debanked Nigel Farage, and they initially claimed it's because that the amount of money he had fell below a certain threshold. Then it turned out that that was a lie, and he was able to use basically banking disclosure laws to reveal that it all had to do with his political opinions, that he was pro-Brexit, that he was skeptical of funding the Ukraine war, etc. And yeah, I mean, this is really terrifying, precisely because, as you said, in most markets, you're really only dealing with 2, 3, 4 prevalent actors. There's this idea, which much of the sort of free market conservative worldview is based on a late 18th century Arcadia, where there was a brief period of time in the late 18th century when capitalism actually looked like the picture painted in laissez-faire theory. But ever since then, since the rise of the industrial era, just because of barriers to entry, because of network effects, because of factory effects and so on, most markets are dominated by just a few actors. So what that means is that the individual's bargaining power relative to these, that includes for wages, of course, but also for, as a consumer being protected, is very limited unless government does something to protect you. And here we can start to get into solutions specifically for the debanking problem, which is not unlike the unpersoning of conservatives by social media platforms. There's a great Marxist theorist who said that we should apply the common carrier doctrine to social media companies. That Marxist theorist is actually a justice of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, who said that in a kind of, it was just a dissent, and it was a kind of indicta, but he said we may have to invoke that. So the common carrier doctrine is something that goes back to English common law. It says that for companies that provide these essential services that we all have to rely on, that are kind of public-facing services like, toll bridges, or that are privately operated, or
the electric company,
railroads, phone company. Like your phone company, if you still have a landline phone, which I certainly don't anymore, but if you still have a landline phone, you're like, Bell or whoever, AT&T can't get rid of your service, boot you from their service because of the things you say on the phone. So likewise, I think consumer banking should be governed by common carrier doctrine, and I think social media companies, as Justice Thomas has suggested, And this is not some radical solution. It's something that's in the kind of Anglo-American tradition. It's nothing new. So it's one solution for that problem that immediately comes to mind.
You're pivoting into solutions, which is great because that's what I wanted to hear about as we kind of come up on a little bit of a closer. What are some things that you think we ought to be doing to limit sort of predatory or abusive behavior by corporations against sort of employees and citizens?
Well, I mean, I think I start with this idea that the market is not this autonomous thing that is self-willing, that the market doesn't grow on trees. Money markets especially don't grow on trees. These are all products of human laws, human political action. And so what that means is, philosophically, we should think about the market as something that we should have greater control over, because in its origins itself is coercive, right? So the Hamiltonian state, the American Hamiltonian state, think about the first Bank of the United States providing ample credit but disciplining the flow of credit. Think of internal improvements that helped create a national market, turn the United States into a national market, import substitution tariffs that made sure that we didn't become like Britain's backwater, where in other words, Hamilton saved the United States with those measures from becoming India, where we just supply raw material and the Brits hold us down as a captive market for the products of their own manufacturers. So all of that is great, and largely it helped create the American economy we know today, that kind of Hamiltonian system. But note that all of those things are coercive things that the state did. Constitutionally, the Hamiltonian state barred state governments from revising contracts after the fact to rescue debtors. The American model of common law that took hold after the Revolution was far more aggressive about the rights of the entrepreneur than the original English common law. So what I'm saying is, the market system of the United States wasn't just sort of this organic thing that grew. It was the result of politics and policy, and there are some enormous achievements as a result of that. Mm-hmm. By the middle 19th century, the U.S. economy was growing at 3% a year, compared with 0.4% for every year of the 18th century, right? Roughly around 0.4%. So, it unleashed growth, unleashed development, railroads, blah blah blah, the industrial economy. But in reality, the economy that grew is one which is characterized largely by oligopoly. That's again when most markets are dominated by like two or three actors. Like in the 19th century, like Nabisco owned 70% of its market, GE 90% of its market, American Tobacco 90% of its market. Why does that matter? It matters because when in situations like that, the price is no longer this kind of talismanic, magical crystallization of supply and demand and of marginal productivity. The price is really just a measure of relative bargaining power. When you have a few sellers in each market, they basically get to set the price. And so it's political power that determines, in large part, policy and political power that determines the price, especially of labor power, which is another way of saying the wage. And so my suggestion is to renew the New Deal order, because New Deal order recognized that. And so it aimed, especially in this one important market, which is the labor market, to allow the many who are selling their labor power to band together and go up in competition against buyers of labor power, employers, of whom there were far fewer. And it's that numerical kind of asymmetry, the fact that there's only a few employers by many, many, many more workers looking for jobs, that gives the employer his power. But if the many who are selling their labor power could band together in private unions, then they can kind of countervail the power. And this isn't so very different from competition, by the way. Classical laissez-faire theory allows for government action to break up monopolies and create competition. So, but the way that is limited is by saying only competition among sellers or only competition among buyers. But here we're saying let's have government give help to competition of buyers going up against sellers, or sellers going up against buyers in the case of the labor market. And so that's the kind of classic Galbraithian idea of the New Deal, and it resulted in this economy that for the first 3 decades after World War II was characterized by both innovation and mass prosperity, both high rates of unionization and low unemployment. And so I'm not saying, okay, that model didn't have its drawbacks. It certainly hit its certain crises. It hit certain crises by the 1970s. But there's just some basic elements of its logic that I think can be applied to our time. And in fact, we're in a position to maybe bring it about today precisely because we're rethinking globalization. We're rethinking these capillary supply chains where we've gotten rid of all of our own manufacturing. And we can think about having more, once again, a high wage manufacturing economy with high rates of unionization and actually less welfare. That's the other upside to this. If people who don't like the administrative state should want unions and high wages, because what we have right now is a low wage, high welfare economy. When we say high welfare, we don't mean the welfare benefits are generous. In fact, in some ways, they're pretty miserly. But it just means that for workers toward the bottom rungs of the labor market, welfare plays a disproportionately large share, up to half of what they need to make ends meet. And so what that does is not only it puts them at the mercy of employers and all the coercion we talked about at the first half of the show, but it also empowers the sort of welfare administrator, to kind of control the economy and the lives of the poor. And so I think, we want to move toward an economy where that's not the case, that workers have more power, they have higher wages, and moving beyond this kind of neoliberal model that I think has brought us here. And a lot of conservatives now are beginning to question, and I think that's very healthy.
So I had a couple questions about this when I was reading it in the book. The first, if you go back to the New Deal, I would say the New Deal was very pro-oligopoly. Mm-hmm. They didn't like small, unruly producers. They preferred having large, more easy to regulate companies. So are you basically saying that we should make peace with oligopoly? It's kind of inevitable, and that rather than breaking up the oligopoly, we should look to mitigate it through other means?
Yes, I'm saying that although there are certain markets where you'll never have that, like, you'll never have a food service and a restaurant industry that's dominated only by a few sellers. We certainly have big sellers in the kind of fast food market, but people still like, sit down restaurants that have a personality and then aren't owned by, giant co. And so, and agriculture is another one as well. But in other kinds of industries, network and factory-oriented industries, railroads, car manufacture, et cetera, it's just inevitable. And largeness breeds all sorts of salutary effects. So, for example, it's only the large firms that have the wherewithal to do the kind of research and development that it would take right now to try to win the race for the fourth industrial revolution, driven by AI against China, right? So, like, and as my friend Michael Lind says, you don't have mom and pop automobile companies. So all of these, I think it would be more damaging to try to just break them up. And I think the result is eventually they would reconsolidate in a kind of natural way. Eventually they would tend toward bigness anyway. We learned this from railroads in the 19th century, right? When the railroad kind of miracle happened in the mid 19th century, lots of companies entered the fray in this kind of competitive model. And what do? They were all trying to win by volume, so they built lots and lots of track, but not all of their tracks would be used. So a quarter of them had gone out of business, had gone bankrupt catastrophically by the late 19th century. So instead, the federal government essentially allowed a cartelized system to reduce competition on price. And just have kind of like regional actors, et cetera. But the point is that bigness came back. So I just want, so for example, even with big tech, and I'm really opposed to big tech censorship, but I can't imagine what breaking them up per se would look like. Would you do it like by users' last names? You break up Facebook? Do you do it by, how do you break up? And so there's just a lot of value that's preserved by keeping bigness in certain industries. But what I call for is to raise up the countervailing power of the people who are subjected to the bigness. So, for example, there's all sorts of policy things we can do to combat big tech censorship. There are consumer co-ops, which can be federally supported. That's one of the things that the New Dealers did. Agriculture co-ops, again, New Dealers supported all of that. In fact, it was kind of localist in that sense. But the point is that it's not just for workers and unions. In all of these relationships where you have buyers and sellers going up against each other, and there's this asymmetry in power, government can help raise up the power of the other side, rather than just use antitrust indiscriminately. So in this sense, I think the conversation on the right in terms of economic reform is branching off in two interesting directions. One is what I call the Galbraithians, and I would include myself and Michael Lind and Oren Cass on this side of things, where you see the value and bigness in many ways, but you want to sort of tame it. And then you have Brandeisians, heirs to Louis Brandeis, the great Supreme Court justice, who is more about, about just antitrust everywhere. And I just think there are situations where antitrust is appropriate, but in others it's not. And so we should make our peace with big, but then tame it.
And my last question, you're very pro-union.
Mm-hmm.
But when I look around at unions today, they don't necessarily seem to be repping the worker interests. So for example, a lot of Starbucks stores recently unionized, and the big thing the unions was complaining about was that Starbucks was not letting their store put on as elaborate a pride displays as somebody claimed they wanted to do. They said Starbucks isn't letting us put on pride. Whether that's true or not, that really has nothing to do with working conditions or contracts or pay. Why would we think that unions today in this world would actually care about the actual workers as opposed to just being another independent political actor of a leftist variety?
Yep. So I would say, first of all, even the Starbucks union, as obnoxious as it is on this kind of cultural stuff, will still fight for things that, regardless of what you think about the ideological cultural views of the purple-haired precarious barista, she deserves better wages, and it would stabilize the economy in various ways if she were more financially secure and had access to better healthcare and so on. But the second thing I would say is that the drift of the labor movement in this country toward being totally aligned with the Democratic Party, and especially increasingly with the kind of wacky, culturally left-wing wing of the Democratic Party, is in part a result of a kind of desperation and the fact that labor lost its independent voice because the Republican Party, which as recently as Richard Nixon was competitive with labor, meaning like Nixon successfully courted the labor vote. Since then, the Republican Party has become so doctrinaire in terms of being management side and anti-union that labor has to go to the direction of the Democratic Party, and labor and the Democratic Party become ever more intertwined. So, for example, the AFL-CIO is like super pro-abortion. We support abortion up to the whatever the insane thing the Democrats stand for. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? Why? Because the majority of the ordinary, like Teamsters, carpenters, electricians, railroad hands, etc., they actually might be pretty pro-life. Maybe not as pro-life as you and I are, but they're not like into abortion in the 9th month or basically practically on the delivery table, right? So if we had a Republican Party that was willing to be a little bit better on labor issues, and you're seeing signs of that with figures like Senator Hawley, Senator Rubio, Senator Vance, these kind of more neo-populists post-Trump, they're trying to reach out to labor. If you have that, then labor can begin to have an independent voice, and it becomes one of the coalitions of the Republican Party, reflecting its current base, right? Trump won the highest marginal share of union households for a Republican president since Ronald Reagan. In 2020, then he expanded that away from not just the white working class, but he expanded into working class people of color as well. So when you think of that, you're going to have people who are voting for the Republican Party. They're going to be smart enough to say, hey, are you doing pro-worker stuff for me? Is the Republican Party doing enough about industrial policy, bringing manufacturing back, and being a little bit less pro-Wall Street? And if we fail to do that on the right, then yes, these voters will become apathetic and cynical again. Many of them probably will just go back to not voting at all. And then the Democrats will continue to capture the labor movement and turn it into like an adjunct for their own professional managerial class, like abortion and gender ideology obsessions. So the choice is up to, I think, to the right to make a little bit of outreach, because the official labor movement may have those tendencies, But a lot of your local labor council guy doesn't want to, he's not into this sort of stuff. He wants benefits, he wants retirement security, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we can actually divorce labor, including organized labor, to be clear, from the insanities of the cultural left. And it would be pretty salutary for the culture as well.
All right. Sohrab, thanks for joining me. And Sohrab Ahmari is the author of the new book, Tyranny Inc, How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It. There's a link to buy it in the show notes. Thank you for joining, sir. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron. This was great.